I think that I've kind of really lived the psychedelic renaissance in a way, like growing up just north of London, like yeah, when I was 16, 17, 18, like psychedelics were, beginning to sort of float around, ketamine, MDMA, and then when I moved to Montreal when I was 20 for an exchange, there was so many all of the other psychedelics really kind of floating around university, and I was into raving, so I would go to like house and techno parties, dubstep parties. So yeah, it was kind of natural. I was into electronic music, right? And that summer I went traveling in South America, and for a stretch, I was with a friend. And one morning, she was like, "Should we do it?" We were in Peru, and I was like, sure." I was a bit taken aback, because usually she wasn't the type of person to kind of propose like big plans. Like we would go on hikes and stuff. So I was kind of, curious. Like I was like, what was she talking about? So a few hours later, I was like, "Wait, what were you talking about earlier?" And she was like, "Ayahuasca." I was like, "Oh, right." I'd never heard of ayahuasca before. Right? I was 21 years old. And so she was really set on it. She'd done some research. I, do some cursory research. And probably like 10 days later, we're in Iquitos, which is, the jungle ayahuasca city. And then we went off into the jungle, and we did like a kind of private retreat with a Quechua medicine lady, and yeah, it was a very profound experience for my friend. Not so much for me, although I wonder if I was ready for a kind of big experience. So that obviously planted a seed of curiosity, and then it kind of all dovetailed with my work. Like when I started working as a professional journalist, like 2017, the medical cannabis story was big at the time, and then it kind of naturally sort of became about psychedelics, I guess. Well, I'd written for student media, and then I became an editor at a student paper, the comment editor in 2014. And some of the guys there in the office, some of the older guys were writing for Vice. So once I kind of had mustered a few ideas, I managed to get in and write a handful of stories for Vice back then in Montreal, and then during my travels in Latin America. And then yeah, I did a master's two years later at Goldsmiths, University of London. And that led to like work experience at different newspapers, including The Guardian in 2017. And somehow I managed to get two print exclusives front page during my work experience, and another story that got 500,000 views online, and was like the second leading story on the website all day. Feats that I didn't manage to replicate, but they kept me on for a couple of years afterwards. Yeah, I think I've never had an editor sort of straight up tell me, "Look, we don't want positive stories about psychedelics. Look, we're only looking for kind of negative stuff." Maybe I don't have the level of relationship with people to have those frank discussions, but for me, I would say certainly now. I mean, it's obviously interwoven with the trajectory of my career, so it's kind of difficult to say, right? But now there certainly does seem to be, far greater interest, and not just far greater interest, but a openness to the benefits of psychedelics. Whereas I think when I started out, there was a bit more of a cautiousness. But at the same time, there was less data. I mean, there's not that much data now, but there is obviously, is much more. And I think culturally, now tons of people are doing mushrooms or microdosing or, this, that, and the other, going to ceremonies. And I think that that's diffusing through, right, through society. And as I say, yeah, creating a greater openness. I mean, still now there's, you need to be critical, like to be credible, right? Not all the time, but like mainstream media stories, it can't just be like a puff piece about X, Y, Z, and for good reason. But I think you can see that the journalism on this topic is becoming more nuanced and better, and long may it continue. For sure, yeah. I mean, the media kind of operates in an interesting way structurally. And I think that there's kind of always a sort of boom and bust, and it's a constantly like cyclical pattern with a lot of topics, and indeed a topic deemed to be controversial that's kind of outside of mainstream debate or the Overton window. It has this journey to the mainstream and to being kind of accepted. And I think there was, around How to Change Your Mind's publication, there was a, perhaps necessary boom in like positive stories about psychedelics. But yeah, clearly they lacked a lot of nuance and probably reflected like a lack of psychedelic education, I guess. But then at the same time, it was, as I say, like a correction to several decades of mostly negative coverage that was strongly influenced by um, negative research that was intended to be negative, right? Like a lot of these, like US grants, they were skewing towards research that would be negative, and I think the media reflected that, and the media does reflect those things, right? Like when a a press release comes out on a study, well, that's a story. There's a symbiotic relationship between, the news media and the news. So if no one's making the positive studies, then who's going to write about the positive studies, right? But yeah, now we're in this place where, only over the last month there was the Business Insider story on the mushroom school. I can't remember the name, but it was, a very, very great piece by Katie McBride, and, revealed some, serious, very serious things. Can't exactly recall everything. But then there was also the Guardian long read on ayahuasca international, and this chap Alberto Villalobos, which was a little bit annoying actually, because I'd been on that story for quite a while and hadn't managed to find a home for it. But journalism's all kind of right time, right place, right framing. You just got to find the right editor at the right time. That it's yeah, it's an interesting game. And then yeah, Jules Evans put out a story I think last week on the Ayahuasca Foundation, where there was a recent death. And I did think it raised some serious questions. I know that the piece has come in for some critique. I think, on the face of it, it's raised some serious questions. So yeah, all of this just reflects how many people are doing psychedelics. And yeah, slowly, I think the media and society and culture is being influenced by that, right? Yeah, I mean, it could be at times when I was at the Guardian, hugely stressful. And it's not a light-hearted place to be working. And it shouldn't be, I suppose. I mean, you're in the hot seat, and sometimes like working on like breaking news stories that more than 1 million people are reading or going to read, right? And there's like an intensity to it, and a time pressure. And sometimes you're going into certain stories from a standing start, right? And you're just trying to kind of piece something together from your office silo. But it was a great place to cut my teeth, and met many amazing people, and received some great instruction. Shout out to Rob Evans here, like really great guy. Um, a bit about my process now. I mean, yeah, there's so much going on. Like you could always potentially be working, but now with the freelancing, I've got to a pretty decent place where I've got like a decent work-life balance. Last month I was fortunate enough to go to a couple of festivals and do stories there. One on kind of doing it sober, which I thought was kind of zeitgeisty and indeed a challenge. One in which I managed to surpass, and I did a story on ketamine spoons, which seem to be everywhere now. At this other festival a couple of weeks ago, which will be out in a couple of weeks, and then I was in Northern California for this story on cannabis farming and civil liberties. So I've been really busy, but then you're back at your desk for like the foreseeable future now, chained here. Um, but you've got to like I've got my sources, people send me stuff, other things, I see flash up. Um, Other times, editors email me with things. So yeah, I think it's like a really great job to have, really. I mean, it's probably a young person's game to some extent until you kind of get like more established and you're in a flow where things are kind of coming to you a bit more. And yeah, hopefully I've arrived in this place and hope to be able to stay here. Well, certainly legal threats to stories can be, something to navigate, right? Like you produce a story and then you go to some of the people concerned and you present your facts and they respond with a legal letter, like threatening a lawsuit. And especially now, like, with editors and everything, news desks more overwhelmed, it seems, than ever. It's like, they only really want to kind of devote a lot of kind of manpower to, stories that they really want to get behind. So that can obviously be a challenge. I mean, I was doing more investigative stuff a couple of years back when I was writing often for The Guardian. But now, I mean, there's a long lead time. There's a very long lead time for stuff like I'm doing more kind of long form stuff, like 4 or 5 thousand word territory, and these things can take a year to go through, and in some cases, quite often you don't get paid until it's been published, and then different things are happening. Like I'm waiting for this story at the moment where a chap is going through criminal justice process, and we've decided that we'll give it a bit of time to publish the story and see how it plays out. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting, but it's I wouldn't say stressful, but it's certainly like something on your mind, basically. I mean, part of it is coming into a kind of more meditative space with all of this, a more philosophical space, and I think that comes with time, depending on your character. So there's that. I mean, what else can I say about, being a journalist today? I mean, you've just got to have many strings to your bow and have a lot of projects concurrently that you're working on, waiting to be published, waiting to be edited, etc. So yeah, hugely exciting though. Hugely exciting. Yeah, I'm more about like what's an interesting story, like where are the characters, where's the jeopardy, what's alive here. I'm yeah interested in exploring like kind of psychedelic culture, how that's changing, what it looks like, especially in the States, because it's often, completely insane. Um, but the use of psychedelics for creativity and problem solving, I think is fascinating. I'm doing a profile on Bruce Damer at the moment, who runs the Centre for Minds and has had some very interesting experiences in his life with and without psychedelics. And yeah, it's really kind of emerging as a leading voice in the field. So excited to see that one come out. Um, and of course, like the dark side. I mentioned some stories earlier. I think that certainly the media is like catching up because yeah, I think that there hasn't been the kind of real nuanced, hard hitting stuff really on the dark side as much as there is now. And so I think that that's good to see. Obviously, I want to get stuck in with it a bit myself. I've got several stories that are just taking time. So it's one of those things. Well, one of these stories that I mentioned during my work experience at The Guardian, the Prime Minister had to go and give an interview like that afternoon as a result of the story. Like basically, it was about EU nationals after Brexit receiving deportation letters under some sort of because they'd applied for right to remain and that had been rejected, and then through some sort of, as it transpired, a bureaucratic malfunction had received these deportation letters. So the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, had to go out onto the cameras and give an interview kind of apologizing for the error. So that was a real baptism of fire for me in my career. The next year in 2018, another story that comes to mind, before medical cannabis was legalized in the UK, there was a group of parents campaigning for access for their children with epilepsy. And yeah, they couldn't get hold of it, right? They had to like go to Holland and live in Holland if they wanted to access it. But it turned out that there was a company called GH Pharma that were actually, connected to some powerful figures in the UK that had a huge medical cannabis farm in Kent, I believe it was. And that they were exporting, hundreds of tons, as I recall, hundreds of kilos, certainly hundreds of kilos. It's not even that much, but a lot, a lot. Like I think the UK was the leading medical cannabis exporter globally. So somehow a photographer and I got ourselves like into the perimeter of the compound. We basically got this like taxi driver that apparently took scientists there sometimes. So they, when we came up to the door, they just like flagged him through. So that story, picked up a bit of traction because obviously it was exposing this kind of hypocrisy that medical cannabis wasn't legal, but this company's making millions by supplying the European market where it is legal. Yeah, with psychedelics, my story for Rolling Stone last year was a pretty big deal. I basically went to an Ibogaine clinic in Mexico, in Cancun, in 2022 for a story, just to kind of cover the rise of Ibogaine clinics and its use for addiction. And yeah, I did it myself in like a kind of hospital ICU bed, like all like yeah, all kind of strapped up with all of the kind of heart rate monitor, pulse monitor, IV, and it went very well. It went very well. I yeah, don't want to talk about it too much, I guess, but I had a powerful experience, and it certainly really connected to me to my parents and to my faith. Actually, it was yeah, a very, very powerful experience. But on my second to last day, I met this chap, a New Yorker, and I didn't think much of it at the time. We had a nice exchange. He went out to smoke a cigarette. He was quite hyperactive. And a couple of months later, I discovered that he died, after his Ibogaine trip at the clinic. So yeah, I wrote this story kind of really exploring him and his journey at the clinic, and the questions that there were to ask about the circumstances of his death. It was like, I mean, I was in the bed for 12 hours,
Mm.
sort of from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Yeah, I'm not sure if he gave me a huge dose.
Mm.
I think that I mean, the ironic thing is, I think that they were generally more on the cautious side with the dosing. And yeah, I had visions. They were a little bit kind of, they came in a bit of a flash. Like I think I was having a powerful visionary experience for about 45 minutes, not longer,
Mm.
because people can with Ibogaine have these sort of hours long, like autobiographic, like recall dreams where one sees oneself as a protagonist,
Mm.
right? Like that's kind of crazy. Like, where does the memory come from me seeing the back of my head right now? Like I can't see the back of my head, but it's almost like you're a fly on the wall. And I did have a couple of those visions where I saw myself in a manner that I'd never experienced during dreams. So yeah, fascinating, fascinating. I would say the roller coaster experience was about 4 or 5 hours. Yeah. Yeah, it's a different, it's a whole nother, I mean, it might not even be, it's hugely dissociative, right? So it's like being on like a very, very large amount of ketamine, but then kind of being on the floor, you really can't like, get up. And if you do, you need to be supported. And then, yeah, it has this kind of almost like ayahuasca quality, but it's more kind of earthy, right? Like it comes from Gabon. It's a root bark.
Yep.
And so yeah, there's like African elements, to the visions, and like yeah, an intensely kind of purgative physical and mental experience. Like I was having kind of these kind of negative thoughts towards the end, like nothing too serious, but just a kind of repetitive, I don't know, judgmental thinking, the egoic mind.
Mhm.
And so I say to the guy like, oh man, oh, this, that, and the other's going on. He's like, oh, so you're having a mind purge, huh? Like that's kind of typical to it too. And yeah, it's a really intelligent plant, intelligent medicine that folks are only just beginning to understand in relation to its effect on like traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and for US veterans, it's become popular because it's a reliable kind of total reset, and I think can take people from being in a kind of fight or flight state to one of kind of relaxation. I mean, at the clinic, there was some people with serious addictions, and this one chap like couldn't look you in the eye, and was only really speaking to the doctor, like very socially awkward. And the day after his treatment, he was doing yoga class. I mean, it was a very gentle class, but we were having a sort of laugh and a joke outside, which seemed completely incomprehensible, right? Like, beforehand. But yeah, the only issue is it disrupts, the heart rate, and can lead to far greater like QT variability. So yeah, that there's peril and promise for sure. Well, I write fairly regularly for Double Blind, which is a magazine based out of LA that puts out a steady stream of great stuff, and often has like news elements. Um, Henry's Tricycle Day newsletter, very good way of keeping up to date. Obviously, the Microdose newsletter by Jane is great too. Jules's ecstatic integration newsletter is great, and he often posts like sort of roundups of stories, and kind of says what's interesting at the moment. I mean, he's really sort of giving away stories. Um, yeah, and then following folks on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. There's some new media. I don't actually know what they're going to be called, but a friend of mine is working for them. They've got some money. Going to write some stories for them that they're going to get up and running soon. So there's kind of, yeah, some new money coming into the space, perhaps because, yeah, it certainly, like, for all the hype, it's clear that there's not a ton of money around, and that was very clear at the Maps conference this year. Like that, they were really doing it on a shoestring budget, it seemed, and that was clear. Like the halcyon days of 2023 are over, at least for now, until they, get the billionaires on board. Um, but yeah, you would think that the psychedelic kind of media ecosystem is going to continue to expand in the coming years. Um, because there's only so much the mainstream media can cover, right? And this stuff's of interest for people. I mean, John Semley did this great story on LSD and the history of this particular type of LSD from Rolling Stone a little while ago. Um, and yeah, that's the sort of story that is probably only of interest for psychedelic enthusiasts. And there's only so much space for that, I guess, in the mainstream media. There was this other story in Wired about this chap Akasha Song who like supplied all of the DMT on the dark web that was um, really interesting. So yeah, there's so much to write about. Yeah, I wrote a couple of times for them in 2022, and I was working with Ken Jordan, who sadly passed away last year. So yeah, my condolences to his family. I think that they lost a bit of funding. I don't know where they were getting their funding from, but they're still putting out bits and pieces. I know that there was a story on these like Massachusetts campaign finance potential violations recently by Jack and Noah. So yeah, they're doing a few bits and pieces. But yeah, I don't think there's a real, like, Double Blind is there, but also Double Blind has had some serious challenges with funding. So I don't really think that there's a kind of like premier psychedelic news outlet. I mean, I don't know if there necessarily has to be, but yeah, at the same time, yeah, there's probably a gap there for sure. Yeah. Yeah, she did amazing, Shelby, right? Like, absolute visionary. And the magazine that they released, I think, biannually, was a work of art. And I wrote for it a couple of times, and yeah, I think it's just like, the money in the space is just not enough. Like the advertising wasn't quite enough, but also I think it was like the changes to the algorithm. The stuff just wasn't showing up in Google, whereas originally stuff was coming up like in the top five in Google, like, consistently. But yeah, I think that there has been a kind of attack really on psychedelic journalism, by Google, by Meta, which is like shadow banning the content, banning accounts for talking about psychedelics, not even purveying psychedelics, just like, saying the wrong thing, or suggesting that people should, or suggesting people do take psychedelics. Like some of the things that people have been flagged up over have been very arbitrary. And, you know, half of Silicon Valley are taking psychedelics. So I mean, it just shows in some way, I suppose, like regulatory concerns that that they don't want to be seen to be kind of promoting federally illegal substances. But clearly there needs to be serious legislative reform, right? Like, it's just not fit for purpose, the law right now, and the amount of people that are taking psychedelics illegally clearly just makes a mockery of these laws that say that they have no medicinal value, right? Like, clearly there are dangers, and I've written about those, and I'm not shy about talking about them. But yeah, it's a preposterous situation, right? For like alcohol to be available on every street corner, at least in some places, certainly in the UK. And to talk about psychedelics on Instagram, at least in certain contexts, just gets your account summarily taken down. Like that's a ridiculous situation. Yeah, well, as I say, that I think there's been this kind of hype bubble that's being kind of balanced out now, but still, I think there is the media, the mainstream media at least, can only do so much, and I think it's psychedelics are part of the popular cultural consciousness now, but what are psychedelics? What do they do? You know, a lot of the articles, including my own, don't go, super in detail about that. We're not like producing kind of how to take ayahuasca guides, and I don't think that's the role of the media at all. But people read the headlines, read the stories, and they go out wanting to buy ayahuasca. Like I was literally at this microdose cafe. I mean, that's a whole nother thing that there's like a microdose cafe in Vancouver yesterday for a story for Double Blind, and there's like an adjoining psychedelics dispensary. So we were like taking some photos in there, and these two young boys come in. I mean, they must have been like their early 20s, and they wanted to buy ayahuasca to do at home. And so the kind of lady working there was just saying, right, like you probably should do it, in a ceremony. And but she said that they do have DMT. They were selling DMT vapes, and they weren't very interested in those because I don't think it lasted long enough. And just they were nice lads, but then they were just sort of laughing about stuff. They weren't serious. Like people are chasing oblivion, right? Like that's the sort of common thread a lot of the time, especially with like younger people. And yeah, it's interesting to think about like where that kind of comes from. Um, Possibly, alcohol, like the embeddedness of alcohol in culture, and it's just like, where does that take you? Like, at a certain point with X amount of drinks, it is just into this kind of perhaps blissful, but very weird and sloppy and messy kind of state where you just feel fucking awful, the next day, even if you did feel quite good for a couple of hours. So there's a lack of psychedelic education, obviously, around like, dinner tables and stuff. Like people barely educate their kids about alcohol, so never mind psychedelics. So I think there's, yeah, a lot of room for people to just, you know, get educated and then to not do silly things like brew ayahuasca at home in Vancouver and take it and have a bad trip potentially. um yeah, in terms of like, I don't know, bad actors, I mean Tulum's always a very interesting place for me. I've done several stories from there, including on the Bufo scene, the toad venom scene. And I think Tulum kind of uniquely attracts a certain kind of weird money-seeking neo-shaman. And I think there's, a lot more room for further investigation there. Um, you know, all across the world, for the most part, right, outside of Oregon and Colorado and a few other places in Europe, which are, reforming and Australia. Psychedelics are still illegal. So it attracts a certain type of character, right? A certain type of character that's ready to kind of throw a bit of caution to the wind, risk criminal penalties, right? From the authorities. And so I just think naturally, as I say, that attracts a certain kind of individual that and excludes other kind of individuals that might be, I don't know, a bit more kind of, I don't know, grounded and want to do things by the book and, maybe in like a sort of regulated clipboard kind of way. And I think there's obviously like a space for that. I think that in the psychedelic underground, as we're learning, there are huge abuses going on, and I think a lot of people who come to serve psychedelics haven't really done their own healing work first. And so they risk kind of transposing their own kind of dysregulated states upon the people to whom that they're serving the psychedelics. So there's like a subtlety there, but I think that that kind of thing is potentially widespread. And then at the higher end, when you get to Tulum, there's a full on kind of, people that are giving you toad venom and that are trying to have sex with you. So yeah, there's a huge amount going on. It's far more than one journalist or even 100 journalists could cover. But I think, the more people that get into it and start investigating, yeah, the better. And there's more and more kind of platforms, it seems. Not all of them pay a huge amount, but that are interested in this kind of thing. So, if folks want to create this kind of psychedelic future, I think there's going to have to be, kind of, yeah, rich and dynamic and critical ecosystem around to be able to kind of give that or to create a safe journey.